The Weight of Their Pity, Chapter 1, The Echo in the Ballroom, October 2025. The air in the grand ballroom of the Plano Country Club hummed with a dizzying mix of nervous laughter, nostalgic chatter, and the faint, sweet scent of nostalgia. It was my 35th high school reunion. I am Emily, 52 years old, an English teacher at a local high school, divorced, no children. By all outward appearances, I'd built a perfectly respectable, quiet life, a life I genuinely believed was good. I stood before the full-length mirror, smoothing the fabric of my dress, a sleek, dark blue that complemented my still blonde hair. I felt ready. Not excited, perhaps, but certainly prepared. I'd spent decades cultivating a calm, composed exterior, a fortress around a past that I assumed everyone had long forgotten, or at the very least, rarely thought about. The tragedy, my younger sister, Jenna, gone in a blink, a terrible accident when I was a teenager. An accident that, in the secret chambers of my heart, I knew was my fault. A momentary lapse, a careless decision, and a life so vibrant, extinguished. My parents, consumed by their grief, retreated into themselves, leaving me adrift in a sea of unspoken blame and overwhelming guilt. I'd buried it all, deep down, beneath layers of academic achievement, professional dedication, and a carefully constructed facade of independence. I thought I had survived. I thought I had coped. I arrived at the reunion with a lightness of spirit, a casual confidence. I greeted old classmates, exchanged polite pleasantries, shared a few genuine laughs. It was just as I expected. A walk down memory lane, a chance to reconnect. But then it began, subtly at first. A prolonged hug from Sarah Jenkins, her grip tighter than usual, her eyes lingering on mine with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. The classmate I barely remembered, Michael, caught my eye from across the room and offered a small, sad smile, a gesture that felt oddly intimate. As the evening wore on, it intensified. Every conversation, every interaction began to feel off. People looked at me with a peculiar softness in their eyes. Their voices, when they spoke to me, dropped a notch, infused with an almost tangible tenderness. There were no hearty backslaps, no boisterous jokes, no competitive boasts about careers or families. Instead, their words were laced with an underlying current of compassion, but not the kind that uplifted, the kind that weighed. Emily, old Mrs. Henderson, our former librarian, murmured, patting my arm, her gaze filled with an almost painful sympathy. "You've been through so much, dear. You're such a strong girl." Strong? Yes, I was strong. But why did her voice break as she said it? Then Mark approached. Mark, popular, athletic, the quintessential high school golden boy. He had always been kind but detached. Now his eyes, usually so bright, held a cloud of profound melancholy as he looked at me. He didn't offer a casual, "Hey, Emily, how have you been?" Instead, he clasped my hand, his thumb gently stroking my knuckles. "Emily," he said, his voice low, earnest, "it's really good to see you. You know, we all talked about it after. We were so sorry. It must have been hell." Hell. The word hit me like a physical blow. The tragedy, my fault. They hadn't forgotten. They hadn't ignored it. They hadn't moved on. They had carried it with them, and I had been the subject of their quiet conversations, their whispered condolences, their collective, silent pity. The realization crashed over me with a force that stole my breath. It wasn't just a fleeting glance or an isolated comment. It was everywhere, in every softened gaze, every hushed tone, every awkward pause. I wasn't just Emily, the English teacher, the divorcee. I was Emily, the poor Emily, the one who lost her sister, the one who had been through so much, the one to be pitied. My carefully constructed facade, the one I had painstakingly built over decades, crumbled. It shattered around me, leaving me exposed, humiliated, and utterly, devastatingly enraged. The ballroom, once a symbol of nostalgic joy, transformed into a suffocating chamber, filled with the unbearable weight of their collective pity. The music, once celebratory, now sounded like a mournful dirge, and I, Emily, stood there, not as a confident woman reconnecting with her past, but as the living embodiment of a tragedy that everyone else seemed to remember more keenly than I had ever allowed myself to acknowledge. Chapter 2: A Glimmer of Claire. The click of the mouse was deafening in the sudden silence of my apartment. The screen refreshed, revealing the details of the match. My eyes scanned the text, blurring slightly from the sudden rush of adrenaline. Genetic match, full sibling, confidence 99.99%. It was her. It was truly her, my sister. The words swam before my eyes, then coalesced into an undeniable, breathtaking truth. The profile belonged to a woman named Claire Miller. Age, 55. Location, Eureka, California. A small, coastal town nestled amidst ancient redwoods, hundreds of miles south of Portland. Lydia, Claire. The names felt alien together, yet inextricably linked by the undeniable language of DNA. I clicked on Claire's profile. A small, almost blurry photo appeared. A woman in her mid-50s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Her hair was a slightly darker blonde than Lydia's had been, but the shape of her face, the curve of her jaw, a profound, aching familiarity. It was the face of the toddler I had lost, aged by decades, but still unmistakably her. My hands shook as I typed a message, my fingers fumbling on the keyboard. "Dear Claire," I wrote, trying to keep my tone neutral, calm, to suppress the tsunami of emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "My name is Sarah Holmes. My DNA test indicates a full sibling match between us. My younger sister, Lydia, went missing from Portland, Oregon in 1970 when she was 2 years old. I believe you might be her." I attached a link to the missing person's profile for Lydia Holmes, along with a few blurry, faded photos of my childhood self with a tiny, blonde-haired Lydia. It felt surreal, like sending a message into the void, unsure if it would ever be answered or believed. Days stretched into a week. Each notification on my phone, each chime from my email, sent a jolt of raw hope through me. And then a response from Claire. Her reply was cautious, wary. "Dear Sarah," it read, "I received your message. I appreciate your situation, but I believe there must be a mistake. I am Claire Miller. I am 55 years old, and I know my parents. I was born in Eureka, California, and I have lived here my entire life. My mother, Judith, recently passed away. I'm sorry for your loss, but I was never kidnapped. This must be a misunderstanding." Her words, though polite, were a cold splash of reality. Of course, she had lived a whole life, a different life, with different parents, a different name. How could I expect her to simply accept this seismic shift in her reality? I didn't give up. I sent another message, then another, gentle, persistent, pouring out my story, my decades of searching, the grief of my parents, the undeniable scientific proof. I sent more photos, a picture of our parents, young and hopeful, holding tiny Lydia, a picture of me, 7 years old, beaming, holding my little sister's hand in our backyard, just weeks before she vanished. At the same time, I began to dig. I pulled out old news clippings from 1970, yellowed and brittle with age. I contacted the Portland Police Bureau. The case of Lydia Holmes, missing person, 1970. It was a cold case, buried deep in dusty archives. But one name stood out, Detective Robertson, the lead detective on Lydia's case. He had been nearing retirement then, a veteran cop, known for his dogged persistence. I found an email address for him, now a retired police officer in his late 60s. I sent him a detailed message, attaching the DNA results, the photos, Claire's cautious response. A few days later, Detective Robertson called. His voice, though older and a bit gruffer, held a familiar sense of authority. "Sarah Holmes," he rumbled. "I remember the case. Lydia Holmes haunts me to this day. One of the few I never solved. You say you found her?" His voice held a mixture of skepticism and a profound, hesitant hope. I explained everything. The DNA match, Claire's denial. He listened intently, asking sharp, pertinent questions. "This DNA evidence," he said finally, "it's groundbreaking. It could change everything. I'll pull the old files, see what I can remember. This is something I never thought I'd live to see." His commitment, even after all these years, ignited a new spark of hope within me. Finally, after several agonizing weeks of messages back and forth, of cautious explanations and Claire's hesitant questions, she agreed. I suppose I should meet you," she wrote. "Just to put my mind at ease. I have to know, even though it feels impossible." I booked the earliest flight to California, Eureka, the city by the redwoods. My heart pounded with a nervous anticipation that bordered on terror. What would she be like? Would she see me? Would she believe me? Would the little girl I had lost, the sister I had grieved for my entire life, truly be there, waiting for me? The answer, I knew, would either be the culmination of a lifelong search or another devastating heartbreak. I was ready for either. I had to be. Chapter 3. The Weight of Unspoken Sympathy. The humid October night air in Plano felt suffocating as I stumbled out of the ballroom. The polite smiles, the lingering glances, the hushed tones, they had formed an invisible, suffocating net around me. Each kind word, each sympathetic touch, felt like a fresh wound. I walked blindly through the manicured grounds of the country club, the laughter and music from inside mocking my crumbling composure. I got into my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white. The engine roared to life, a welcome noise that drowned out the insidious whispers of poor Emily. I drove, aimlessly at first, then instinctively turned towards my quiet suburban street. As I drove, the memories of the reunion replayed like a cruel film reel. Mark's earnest, pitying gaze, Rebecca's awkward confession. Even Mr. Harper, my beloved English teacher from high school, had looked at me with such profound sadness when we spoke, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a solemn reverence. "Emily, dear girl," he'd said, his voice soft. "You've always been such a quiet strength, but I know how hard it must have been." His words, meant to be comforting, felt like a judgment, a confirmation of my deepest unspoken fear, that everyone knew, that everyone always knew. The anger began to simmer, a low, dangerous heat in my chest. Anger at them, for their pity, for their silence, for allowing me to believe for decades that I had successfully hidden my scar, when in fact it was emblazoned across my forehead for all to see. And anger, fiercer still, at myself. For being so blind, for being so weak, for failing to protect Jenna, and then for failing to protect myself from their well-meaning yet utterly humiliating sympathy. When I was a teenager, after Jenna, after the accident, my home had become a silent tomb. My parents, consumed by their own unbearable grief, had become ghosts in their own house. My mother, once so warm and comforting, retreated into a shell of silent tears and endless headaches. My father, usually boisterous and present, spent his evenings in his study, the door firmly closed, the clink of ice in a glass, the only sound. They rarely spoke of Jenna or of the accident. They rarely spoke to me. I felt invisible. A constant, aching presence of blame and sorrow, left utterly alone with my guilt. At school, I had tried to disappear, to become a wallflower. I thought my classmates simply didn't notice me, or that my grief had made me unapproachable. I convinced myself that my solitude was a choice, a reflection of my need for quiet. Now I understood. They had noticed. They had watched me. They had pitied me. And their silence, their avoidance, wasn't about my unapproachability. It was about their discomfort, their fear of saying the wrong thing, their inability to bridge the chasm of my sorrow. Rebecca, my best friend, we had been inseparable since kindergarten. After Jenna, Rebecca had slowly, painfully drifted away. I'd told myself she was just busy with other friends, that we were growing apart. But at the reunion, her confession had been a blunt instrument to my carefully constructed narrative. "Emily," she'd said, her eyes brimming with tears, "I'm so sorry. I should have been there for you, but I couldn't. Every time I looked at you, I saw Jenna, and I knew how much you were hurting, and I didn't know what to say. It was too much. I felt so bad for you, so incredibly sorry." Her words, meant as an apology, felt like a confirmation of my worst fears. Her friendship hadn't ended because we grew apart. It had ended because I was a symbol of tragedy, a person to be pitied, not befriended. The pity, I now realized, wasn't just a fleeting emotion. It was a brand, a label I had unknowingly carried for half a century, and it had poisoned every relationship, every interaction, every perception of myself. I wasn't just Emily. I was poor Emily, forever defined by the worst moment of my life. I pulled into my driveway, the engine still running, the silence of my home echoing the emptiness within me. The anger, now cold and sharp, solidified into a desperate resolve. I couldn't live with this illusion anymore. I had to face it, all of it. The truth of that day, the truth of their pity, and the truth of my own profound, unaddressed pain. The facade had shattered. Now I had to rebuild or simply crumble into the dust of what might have been. The shame, the humiliation, the raw, aching wound. It was all here, demanding to be seen. Chapter 4, A Sister's Unspoken Words. The hours after the reunion were a blur of raw emotion. I paced my living room. The anger from the country club replaced by a cold, searing humiliation. Every sympathetic glance, every hushed tone from my classmates, replayed in my mind like a broken record. They had seen me, not the woman I presented to the world, but the perpetually wounded girl, trapped in the shadow of a long-ago tragedy. I finally collapsed onto the sofa, the weight of decades of suppressed grief settling over me. My eyes fell on an old, dusty box tucked away on a forgotten bookshelf, a box of childhood mementos, and inside, Jenna's diary. I hadn't opened it since the immediate aftermath of the accident. It felt like sacrilege, a violation of her memory. But now, a desperate, almost violent need to understand, to somehow connect with her, overwhelmed me. My hands trembled as I lifted the small, floral-patterned book. Jenna's childish handwriting, loopier than mine, filled the pages. I flipped through it, my eyes blurring with tears. Entries about school, about her friends, about her dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Then, I found it. The entry from the day of the accident. My breath hitched. October 14th, she had written, her hand a little more hurried than usual. Emily told me not to go to the creek today. She said it was too muddy after the rain. But I really want to see if the little frogs are back. I told her I'd be super careful. She's always so responsible, sometimes too responsible. I bet I can jump over the big muddy patch. Emily worries too much. Haha. I'll be back before she even notices. A wave of dizzying disbelief washed over me. Jenna. She hadn't blamed me. She had been excited, impulsive. She had even thought I was the one worrying too much. The narrative I had clung to for so long, that my carelessness alone had led to her death, began to crack. She hadn't been a helpless victim of my negligence. She had been a curious, spirited child, making her own choices, however small. And in her innocent way, she had taken responsibility for her own actions, even in the very last moments she described. The tears that had been dammed up for 35 years finally broke free. A torrent of grief, relief, and profound, agonizing confusion. It wasn't my fault. Not entirely. My guilt, a crushing stone I had carried in my chest for decades, did not vanish, but it lightened. The sharp, suffocating edges softened. Jenna hadn't been a lamb led to slaughter by my hand. She had been a vibrant, independent spirit. But the revelation brought another wave of questions. If it wasn't entirely my fault, then what was I carrying? Why had I allowed myself to be defined by this pity for so long? Why had I not sought solace, not allowed anyone in? Instinctively, I reached for my phone. There was only one person I could think of. Mr. Harper, my English teacher. The man who had always seen beneath the surface, who had encouraged me to write, to express myself. He had been at the reunion, his eyes full of that familiar, unsettling sympathy. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm and warm despite the late hour. "Emily, is everything all right, dear?" "No, Mr. Harper," I choked out, my voice raw, the words tumbling out in a rush. "It's not. I was at the reunion, and I realized everyone pities me. They always have, and I hate it. I hate their pity. And I found Jenna's diary. She didn't blame me. She blamed herself. It wasn't my fault. Not entirely." I poured out my heart to him. The decades of buried guilt, the isolation, the crushing weight of their unspoken sympathy. He listened patiently, without interruption. A comforting silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he spoke, his voice gentle, wise. "Emily, dear girl, pity. It's a strange thing, isn't it? It can feel like condescension, like a judgment. But sometimes, Often, in fact, it's simply what people offer when they don't know what else to give, when they feel helpless in the face of another suffering, when they care, but don't have the words or the tools to truly help. He continued, his voice softening further. Your classmates, they didn't see you as poor Emily because they looked down on you. They saw you as poor Emily because their hearts ached for you, because they witnessed a profound tragedy and they saw a young girl trying desperately to hold herself together. Their pity wasn't a slight, Emily. It was their clumsy, inarticulate way of saying, we see your pain, and we are so sorry. His words struck me with the force of a revelation. Their pity wasn't born of scorn, but of compassion. A clumsy, imperfect compassion, yes, but compassion nonetheless. And my own carefully constructed wall of strength, my refusal to show vulnerability, my desperate need to appear fine, that had pushed them away. I had been so consumed by my guilt, by my fear of being judged, that I had interpreted their empathy as something shameful. I had rejected their silent offerings of support because I couldn't bear to acknowledge my own profound vulnerability. After the accident, Mr. Harper continued, his voice tinged with regret. You became so self-contained, Emily. So strong. We all worried about you, but you seemed so impenetrable. I thought you were handling it, that you didn't need our help. He was right. I hadn't needed their help. I had needed to allow myself to be helped. I had needed to grieve. I had needed to forgive myself. But I had been too afraid, too consumed by the false narrative of my own culpability. The conversation with Mr. Harper was a turning point. The weight of their pity, which had felt like a brand of shame, began to transform into something else. It was the echo of unexpressed compassion, the memory of quiet concern, and in that shift, a profound and unexpected sense of peace began to settle over me. The path to healing, I realized, was not about erasing the past, but about reinterpreting it, allowing myself to finally feel the sorrow and to accept the kindness, however clumsy, that had always been there. The first step, I knew, was to acknowledge my own truth, and then, perhaps, to reach out and acknowledge theirs. Chapter 5, Reclaiming the Narrative. The morning after my conversation with Mr. Harper, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in decades. The rage and humiliation had dissipated, replaced by a quiet, determined resolve. The weight of their pity, once so crushing, now felt like a testament to unspoken empathy. I had been so focused on my own shame and guilt that I had misinterpreted their compassion as condescension. My first step was to reread Jenna's diary. This time, I didn't just search for answers about the accident. I read it as a sister, trying to reconnect with the vibrant, spirited girl she truly was. Her hopes, her dreams, her innocent observations, they filled the pages, breathing life back into her memory. I found more entries that chipped away at my self-blame. Jenna's impetuous nature, her adventurous spirit, her occasional disregard for rules. She was just a child, curious and bold. It wasn't my singular fault. It was a tragic accident, a convergence of circumstances, and a child's natural curiosity. The guilt, while still present as a whisper, no longer screamed in my ears. Then came the harder part, reaching out. I started with Rebecca, my former best friend. Her confession at the reunion, though painful at the time, now felt like a desperate plea for forgiveness, a desire to mend a long broken bond. I called her. Her voice was hesitant when she answered. Rebecca, it's Emily, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I wanted to apologize for my reaction at the reunion, and I wanted to thank you for being honest. There was a long pause, then a sob. Emily, oh Emily, I felt so awful about that night, and for all these years, I wanted to reach out so many times, but I didn't know how. I was so sorry about Jenna. I know, I said softly, tears welling in my own eyes. I know you were. We both were. I was so caught up in my own pain, my own guilt, I couldn't see past it. I thought your sorrow was judgment, and I pushed everyone away. We talked for hours. Rebecca poured out her own feelings of helplessness and guilt, her regret over letting our friendship fade. I shared my newfound understanding from Jenna's diary. The slow process of reevaluating my own role in the tragedy, it was raw, honest, and profoundly healing. By the end of the call, a thread, long broken, was beginning to reweave itself. We made plans to meet for coffee next week. Next, I sent a text to Mark. Mark, this is Emily. I appreciated our conversation at the reunion. I had a lot to process afterwards. Would you be open to a coffee sometime? No agenda, just a talk. To my surprise, he replied almost immediately, absolutely. Emily, I'd like that very much. When we met, Mark was as kind and earnest as he had been at the reunion. I explained how their collective pity had affected me, how it had reinforced my buried guilt. He listened, his expression thoughtful. Emily, he said finally, we were kids. We didn't know how to react to something so shattering. We saw your pain, and we didn't know how to help. We wished we could. Our pity was clumsy, I know, but it came from a place of genuine care. His words confirmed Mr. Harper's wisdom. Their pity wasn't a weapon. It was an awkward but heartfelt gesture of compassion. I had spent decades misinterpreting it, letting it define me in a negative light, when it was simply a reflection of shared humanity. My perspective on the tragedy began to shift fundamentally. It was no longer a secret, shameful burden I carried alone. It was a shared experience, a moment of profound sorrow that had touched many lives, including those of my classmates. I started to talk about Jenna more openly, not with self-recrimination, but with love and remembrance. I shared her diary entries with Rebecca, with Mark, painting a fuller picture of the bright, independent spirit she was. I also began to acknowledge my own grief, something I had suppressed for so long. The tears came, sometimes unexpectedly, but they were no longer tears of guilt, but of sorrow for a life lost and for the years of pain I had carried unnecessarily. I sought out a therapist, a compassionate woman, who helped me navigate the complex layers of guilt, grief, and identity that had defined my adulthood. It was a difficult process, but also incredibly liberating. The next time I saw Mr. Harper, he noticed the change immediately. "You're glowing, Emily," he said, a genuine smile replacing his usual melancholic one. "You look lighter." "I am, Mr. Harper," I replied, a warmth spreading through me. I finally allowed myself to be seen, and in doing so, I finally allowed myself to heal. I continued teaching, but with a renewed sense of purpose. I encouraged my students to embrace their vulnerabilities, to seek connection, to not be afraid of their own emotional truths. I spoke about the power of words, not just to tell stories, but to heal them. The weight of their pity, once a source of deep shame, had transformed into a profound understanding of human compassion. I wasn't poor Emily anymore. I was Emily, a woman who had endured a profound loss, who had carried a heavy burden, but who had finally found the courage to put it down, to forgive herself, and to allow the world to see her, not with pity, but with acceptance and love. My journey, though painful, had led me to a truer understanding of myself and of the profound, often clumsy, kindness of others. And in that understanding, I finally found a quiet, enduring peace.